Hello, and welcome to Cutting Through. I'm Mitchell Plitnick. In debates that we see all the time, frankly, over Israel and Palestine, we frequently see a particular argument about Zionism and Jewish connection to the land of Palestine and Israel. And we see two basic camps, because unfortunately the debate is very often simplistic and not very well informed, frankly. Here to try and correct some of that. So the two camps, one of them says that Israel, Zion, is a basic part of Judaism, and it always has been. This has always been a part of Jewish identity. People talk about the concept of Zion in Judaism. Talk about, in at the Seder, we say next year in Jerusalem, and so on and so on. The other side says, especially as regards Ashkenazi or European Jews, that this is really all made up and there's no real connection between Jews and the land. And both arguments are very wrong, and really do require some examination and nuance. And that's why I titled this video, Zion versus Tziyon. So I want to use those two words, the English pronunciation Zion, to talk about Zionism and to talk about how that has been applied to modern Judaism and to obviously the interplay between modern Judaism and the state of Israel. And I'm going to use Tziyon to talk about the actual concept of Tziyon, which I will explain in a bit, in the Jewish religion. So, look, the reality is that for many Jews, especially those involved with so-called mainstream organizations, the state of Israel is a fundamental part of their Jewish identity. That is real. That is a real thing. They feel that connection to Israel, but it's a problem that frankly, that they feel that way because of that, many Jews can't bring themselves to believe the reality of Israel's nature, of its policies and its actions. They minimize them, they rationalize them. Sometimes they just outright deny them. And they do this to varying degrees. Some people who have this feeling struggle with it and need to find a way to reconcile what they know to be true with their feeling of attachment to Israel as part of their Jewish identity. Other people just run into denial. And unfortunately, that tends to be the dominant reaction in the Jewish community these days. But for those people, and really for all the people who have that feeling, there is a truly visceral reaction to criticism, especially harsh criticism of Israel, that feels like an attack on their own Jewish identity. And I realized that a lot of people simply dismiss that. Well, they shouldn't feel that way. Well, they do. And it's not something that should be dismissed. It's a human thing, it's a real thing, and we should try and find ways to address that. Look, I know this from personal experience. I grew up as an Orthodox Jew, very, very attached to Israel, in an extreme environment that supported people like Rabbi Meir Kahana, the settlement movement, really, really out there people. And there were others who were more supportive of what one might call the mainstream or the Tel Avivian Israel. But that was the environment I grew up in. I understand this attachment to Israel. Even when I was no longer part of that community, I still felt in my heart a lot of that attachment. And I still care about Israel. I know many people in Israel, of course, and I care about what happens to them. And I care about Israel's future, and what it should be, and how to deal with the fact that it is, founded on an extreme nationalist ideology, and what that means in real life. So my point is that I understand this feeling. It doesn't come out of nowhere, and I understand where it happens from. But I also understand that that visceral reaction is manipulated, it is magnified, and it is played upon every single day by those mainstream Jewish organizations, the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, et cetera, much more so than a group like AIPAC, for example, which more or less plumbs they sort of harvest the results of those feelings and turn them into political tools. But we see this all the time. We see people. I mean, this is what the equation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is all about. It's all about um, amplifying that feeling among Jews and among other people who sympathize with that way of thinking, amplifying the feeling that a criticism of Israel, attacks on Israel, are forms of anti-Semitism. And that can be people who talk about all criticism of Israel that way, a lot of those. It also translates to those who say, well, you can criticize Israel and you can even call Gaza, what happened in Gaza, genocide. But what you can't question is Israel's right to exist as an ethnocratic Jewish state. And I disagree with that as well. You can debate that point. You know, you can argue that Israel should exist. I mean, there's no question of right to exist because states do not exist by right. No, you know, the nature of various states are horrible in many different ways. Israel is not alone in that. Israel, though, is the only one where it's considered somehow out of bounds to say, no, this oppressive system should not exist. Um, we say that about the United States. We say that about Europe. We say that about the United Kingdom. We certainly say that about many, many countries, Russia. We say that about many countries in the global South that are, in fact, dictatorships. We say this all the time. There's, you know, and we say it about all countries. Different groups say it about different countries. But Israel has that special protection, and um, even that is part of this equation that I'm talking about. This sense that that Zionism, an attack on Zionism per se, that is to say that if you argue that a state based on Jewish nationalism cannot even, you know, it doesn't, even if you want to say it doesn't have to be as bad as Israel's been in the past few years or as bad as Israel ever was. Um, Many people believe Israel could be much better and still be an ethnically Jewish state, a fundamentally Jewish state. Um, that's a debate to have, and it's fair to argue either case. But it is not anti-Semitic to suggest that intensely nationalist forms of states are going to discriminate against people outside of that nation. So you either have an ethnically homogenous country or you're going to have problems. And that's where that objection comes from. But to get back to this main point here, so when we talk about Zionism, you know, the choice to call Zionism is Jewish nationalism. That's what it means. And the choice to call it that, I mean, the term was initially used by Nathan Birnbaum in the late 19th century, but it had been applied to, for example, the Chovevei Tziyon, the lovers of Zion, who began their movement years before Birnbaum first coined that phrase. There's an irony that Nathan Birnbaum is the first one who's known to have publicly used the phrase Zionism to describe the Jewish national movement, because Birnbaum later became an Orthodox Jew and was virulently anti-Zionist. But that's just a funny little anecdote. But yeah, the Chovevei Tzion, the lovers of Zion, were among the first people, first Jews to sort of organize mass immigration, and their ambition was much less political. They were part of what you would call the first Aliyah, the first wave of Jewish immigration to Palestine, and most of them ended up leaving. They found life in Palestine too harsh for them, but their ambition was to set up a self-sustaining Jewish community in Palestine. It wasn't about a state. That came much more with the second Aliyah after the World Zionist Congress of 1896, and that carried its way through World War I and the Balfour Declaration and all of that, that I'm sure you're all familiar with. And many of those people also did not stay in Palestine, but we're not here to go through the whole history. Um, the name has real significance, but it's a name that touches on religious Jewish significance, but is being used by a secular movement, because Zionism was a secular movement. The Chovevei Tziyon were a mixture of religious and secular Jews from mostly from Europe, although from few other places. Some Yemeni Jews emigrated around the same time, but they were all, fleeing persecution and wanted to set up a Jewish community in Palestine. The name arose, and Birnbaum coined it, I assume, because it spoke to something that really is fundamental. And here I'm going to talk about Tziyon as distinct from Zionism. Tziyon is, in its strict definitional sense, it represents the land of Israel. It represents Jerusalem and the temple, the Beit HaMikdash. But it means much more than that. It isn't a thing, an object, a place. It is the Jewish redemption from the exile that God decreed on us with the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans more than 2,000 years ago. That is what Tziyon really means. It is the redemption, and it is a much, much bigger concept than just a Jewish state. Although, it is connected to the idea that all the Jews will gather in to Israel, Palestine. But it's a much bigger concept than that. It's a state of grace, essentially, that Jews attain. And when we attain it because of our good behavior and our piety and our righteousness, God then decides that, okay, you merit an end of the exile, sends the Messiah, the Mashiach, to redeem not only Jews, and I think this is a really important concept. In Christian mythology, I'm sorry, in the Christian Testament, you have the Book of Revelations, which has just millions of horror movies based on it. And there's a lot of fire and brimstone. And of course, many Christians have taken it to mean that the righteous will be saved and the unrighteous will suffer. That's not the Jewish vision of the Messianic era. The Messiah comes to save the entire world, not just the Jews. The idea is that the Messiah shows the world the truth of God, and the result of that, of people learning the truth of God, is that we overcome we by learning that truth, and by seeing the truth of God, we overcome poverty and misery, war, and all of the things that make the world a drag, and um, and live in harmony. And the Jews would all be gathered into the land, including every Jew who ever lived. The Tchiyat HaMetim, the revival of the dead, and they live in the Holy Land. But the rest of the world is content and happy, and there's no part of that mythos that ever talked about forcing anyone else who might be there out of the land in order to make room. How that works, well, who knows? But but it is a very, very positive vision where the 613 commandments or mitzvot that Jews carry out and that we are responsible for. Is actually expanded, but in a very positive way. And non-Jews still only have to, follow the 7 commandments, which are which are ones that don't have to do with recognizing God, even. And it's the basics. Don't kill, respect your mother and father, don't steal, etc., etc. And the world all sees this. The world all comes together. It's a very, very common vision that has very little relationship to the visions of political Zionism, which is very much focused on the Jews and sees the non-Jews who live in Palestine, if we want to describe it in the best light, as obstacles to Jewish ambitions. You know, we may have to allow some of them to live, but we need to make sure that there is a Jewish majority. So we need to find ways to spirit the penniless masses across the borders, pay them or pay other countries to take them in, et cetera, et cetera. But there was always that concept of transfer in Zionism from the beginning. And there was always a sense of the non-Jews being an obstacle, the non-Jews living in Palestine. So the concept of Tziyon, and I think it should be clear by now, the concept of Tziyon is an egalitarian one in the probably the most positive imaginable sense of that word. Everybody gets a real good deal out of it. Really, no one is privileged more than others. Jews are gathered in to the Holy Land, but that's as part of this process to make everyone happy. It's not something where Jews are happier and as some wacky rabbis sometimes say that non-Jews serve them. It's nothing like that. It's a very positive vision. That's Tzion, and it's not Zion. So when you're talking, when we at a Seder say next year in Jerusalem, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about hoping that that vision comes true. That vision comes true by Jewish acts of goodness, essentially, righteousness. So we are nowhere near that point. And all we need to do is look at Gaza and the West Bank to see that, or Lebanon or Syria, et cetera, et cetera. That the idea that the Zionist leaders, early Zionist leaders, took the concept of Tzion and translated it into their political vision. I mean, I don't necessarily find that to be wrong in the sense of, it makes sense. They're you know they're naming it after a part of Judaism. But what's happened since is a rewriting of Judaism and Jewish history to say, no, they're talking about fulfilling this yearning that Jews have had. It's just not true. The yearning Jews had for centuries was not for a piece of land to call their own. It was for redemption from exile. That was what it was. And that's what it still is for many religious Jews. It's the reason that the religious Jewish community, the Orthodox Jewish community, has split on this question of the Jewish state. You have the religious Zionists, and then you have religious non-Zionists and anti-Zionists. And this is a fundamental difference between those groups. So when we're saying next year in Jerusalem, we're not talking about people just hopping a plane and going to Jerusalem, because they could do that now. If that was what that great yearning was, why aren't they doing it? Why don't they go there now? If that's what this was really all about, because it's not, and it never was. It was about the coming of the Messiah, and it was about the Messiah bringing a better world for everyone. This, Judaism is not what I would call necessarily a universalist faith, but this aspect of it is. This aspect of it is universalist. Now, this aspect of it also comes from the Midrash. It comes from Jewish tradition, much more than it certainly does not come from the Torah or the Talmud. So, although it's discussed in the Talmud, but a lot of the real, what I'm getting into here and more detailed and visionary parts of it, really more the Midrash, but they're in the Talmud as well. And incidentally, I would like it if people who've never read the Talmud would stop trying to quote it. The Talmud is not what anti-Zionists sometimes say it is. And in any case, pulling a quote out of context of the Talmud is sure to be misleading no matter what you're using it for. It's just that kind of big tome. But again, I digress. but next year in Jerusalem is a prayer. It's a prayer for the redemption of the Jewish people and the coming of the Messiah. That's Tziyon. And that is not Zionism. That is no part of Zionism. Okay, and the part, in fact, the end world concept that ties political Zionism to end world mythos is very much a Christian invention, not a Jewish one. You know, that is where you really see much of the Christian influence, and from the earliest days of Zionism. In the 19th century, you have the end time uh, Christian beliefs of some evangelical branches of Christianity that saw the ingathering of the exiles, right? The gathering of Jews into Palestine as bringing on not the positive vision of the Jewish Messiah, but the rapture. So that's where that comes from. But I think, and unfortunately, why am I telling you all this? Because it illustrates how badly Zionism has rewritten Judaism for Jews. And I'd like us to be able to be a little bit more sympathetic, I think, to that reality, because what's happening now with when I see everywhere, the word Zionism, the word Zionist, not just used as a pejorative, which I understand certainly. I mean, Zionism has, I mean, the crimes of the state of Israel and therefore the Zionist ideology are are enormous and inescapable. So I understand where they go with that. But when we talk about Zionist and we use the term Zionist to just describe as if like the worst possible people, we're painting with too broad a brush, and we're painting that in a way that includes people who frankly have been duped to see this fixation on a state of a Jewish state in Palestine as part of their Judaism. It isn't, and it wasn't. This is Zionism actually rewriting Judaism. And it's worth not trying to convince, don't try to convince people of it. That's not what I'm doing. I'm not talking to those folks with this. I'm really talking to people who consider themselves anti-Zionist. Say, don't try to convince them of this, of all the things I'm saying, although, you know, this is the reality. Um, but use it for yourself to understand maybe a little bit of how badly they've been duped and how much of their identity they've now invested, and so how threatening Israel's crimes are to them. But they can't admit that. They can't turn and accuse Israel of those things. So they defend it. And it's not okay. And I'm not suggesting anybody back down one iota in indicting Israel's crimes and calling them out and in the strongest possible terms, but without venom, without uh or at least with less rage at the people as opposed to the ideology and opposed to the state. Because uh it there is in Tziyon a symbolic connection to the land that's very real. Whether you're a European, an Ashkenazi Jew, Mizrahi, Sephardic, etc., the many different Jews from all over the world, there is a connection to the land. There's a connection to the Western Wall. There's a connection to the temple, the Beit HaMikdash, the third Beit HaMikdash. Theoretically, the coming of the Messiah would be built in that area. All of this would happen. In a the vision is a very positive one. How that squares with modern politics, of course, it doesn't. But that's part of the problem when dealing with religious iconography. Um, but we should understand that many Jews have been tricked into thinking that this drive for a state is what next year in Jerusalem means. It's what Tziyon means. Tziyon is a really important concept for Jews. It's really the root of the diaspora nature of Judaism. We live in exile until such time as these miracles will occur. We don't decide on miracles. We don't make miracles happen. God does, right? That's the idea. And I'm talking as a secular Jew, but as one with a religious education and who has studied this as a secular Jew in my adult years as well. So, look, there is a real demonstrable Jewish connection to the land, but it's not found in a nationalist discourse or in a colonial project or in an apartheid system. If you're religious, it's found in faith and doing good in the world. And if you're not religious, it's just found in doing good in the world. That is Tziyon. That is the redemption of the Jewish people. Whether we want to think of that as God sending a Messiah or simply us aligning with other oppressed peoples around the world to end oppression and to make this world a better place so that there isn't poverty and starvation and war all the time, or at all, preferably. So that is the difference between Tzion and Zion. And that is, unfortunately, the scam that Zionism has pulled over the Jewish people and has been bought into by way too many Christians, way too many other people. And I think we need to understand it, because I think if we understand it, more of us can feel good about standing up to it in a way that, maybe is less of a, or at least feels like less of an attack to people who are struggling with the idea and are trying to find a way to square the idea of some of the things that Israel has done uh, and their own Jewish identity, and opening a door for a Jewish identity that they can embrace that does not mean supporting the crimes of the state of Israel, because that's one good way to help get to the day where we stop those crimes and there's justice, freedom, and accountability. So if you found this useful, please share, like, subscribe, and if you can support this work, that's deeply appreciated. You can find ways to support me at mitchellplitnick.substack.com, where you can donate or become a paid subscriber. So thank you very much, and I will talk to you soon.